With only a cracked suitcase and $43 tucked into the lining of her coat, 74-year-old Evelyn Marsh stood on the front porch of the house she had lived in for 31 years and listened to the lock turn behind her. Her own son and daughter had just told her, calmly, over coffee, that she was too much to handle anymore. But what Darnell and Priscilla didn't know, what no one in the small town of Solace Creek, Kentucky could have guessed, was that the rotting cabin Evelyn's late mother had left her deep in the hills of Harlan County held something inside its walls that would strip away everything those two believed they had secured and hand Evelyn back, not just a home, but a legal claim that had been waiting in the dark for over 130 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. People talk about rock bottom like it's a single moment. For Evelyn Marsh, it wasn't a single moment. It was a Tuesday morning in March, with weak sunlight cutting through the Kentucky hills and 2 adult children. She had sacrificed everything for standing in the doorway of what used to be her home, watching her drag a suitcase across the porch without offering to help. She was 74 years old. She had raised those 2 children in that house. She had buried her husband, Leonard, from that house 6 years prior. She had painted every room in it twice. She knew which floorboard creaked third from the top of the stairs, and she knew the particular way the kitchen window fogged up on cold mornings, and she knew the sound the furnace made in February when it was working too hard. She knew every inch of that house the way you only know a place after 3 decades of living inside it. And now she was on the outside of it, with a suitcase that wouldn't close all the way and $43 she'd found while packing. Evelyn didn't cry on that porch. She had done her crying the night before, alone in the bedroom, after Darnell had left and Priscilla had stopped returning her calls. By the time Tuesday morning arrived, something in her had gone very still. Not peaceful, still the way a field goes still before a storm rolls in. She picked up her suitcase, walked down the 3 porch steps, and stood on the sidewalk. She looked back once at the house. The curtain in the front window moved slightly. Someone was watching her leave. She turned away and didn't look back again. The question she kept turning over, standing there on that sidewalk with traffic passing and neighbors pretending not to notice, was where exactly a 74-year-old woman with $43 goes when her children have locked the door. She had no savings left. Leonard's small pension had run out 2 years ago. Her Social Security payments came to just under $1,100 a month, barely enough to cover a modest apartment, and she had no apartment. She had a suitcase with a broken latch and the clothes on her back and the specific, hollow feeling of someone who has just been told, in the most practical and businesslike way possible, that she is a problem to be solved rather than a mother to be loved. She stood on that sidewalk for a long time, and then she thought about the cabin. She almost hadn't. The cabin had been sitting at the back of her mind for years, something she filed away under things she didn't want to deal with. Her mother, Cora, had passed 7 years earlier and left Evelyn the only thing she'd ever owned outright. A small, 1-room cabin on a patch of land off Creedmoor Hollow Road, about 14 miles outside Solace Creek, buried in the kind of thick hill country where cell service dropped off and the trees grew close enough together that the road felt more like a tunnel. Evelyn had driven out there once, shortly after Cora died. She'd parked at the edge of the clearing, looked at the sagging roof and the broken front window and the way the porch had partially caved in on the left side, and she had driven away without getting out of the car. She wasn't ready then. Standing on the sidewalk outside the house her children had just taken from her, she thought about that cabin again. It was condemned, most likely. It had no electricity. She was fairly certain the well had gone dry years ago. She didn't know if the floor was still solid or if the roof would hold through spring rain. But it was hers. Cora had left it to her. And as far as Evelyn knew, no one could walk up to it with a real estate agent and tell her to be out by the 15th. That thought, small and plain as it was, steadied something in her. She adjusted the suitcase in her hand, pulled her coat tighter against the March wind, and started walking toward the edge of town. She didn't have a plan beyond the next hour. She didn't have the energy for one. What she had was a direction and just enough stubbornness to move toward it. Later, much later, when people would ask her what she was thinking in that moment, when journalists and researchers and students who visited Creedmoor Hollow would want to know what it felt like to walk away from everything with nothing, Evelyn would pause and give them the same answer every time. She'd say, "I wasn't thinking about surviving. I was thinking about that cabin and whether my mother's roses had somehow come back in the yard." They had, as it turned out. But that part of the story comes later. Evelyn Marsh was not the kind of woman people worried about. That had always been the problem. She was the one who showed up. When Leonard's mother fell ill in the winter of 2003, it was Evelyn who drove 3 hours each way twice a week to bring her groceries and sit with her through the long afternoons. When Darnell's first marriage collapsed, and he moved back home at 31 with 2 suitcases and a bruised ego, Evelyn made up the guest room without being asked and kept her opinions to herself. When Priscilla's youngest was born 6 weeks early and the NICU bills started stacking up, Evelyn quietly emptied a savings account she'd been building for 11 years and handed her daughter an envelope without making a ceremony of it. She didn't talk about any of it. That was just who she was. She had grown up in Harlan County, the daughter of Cora and Willis Marsh, who had very little money but a strong sense of how to carry themselves through the world with dignity. Willis worked the mines until his lungs gave out. Cora cleaned houses and took in sewing and raised Evelyn and her younger brother Teddy with the kind of practical love that doesn't waste time on sentiment, but shows up every single day without fail. Evelyn had absorbed all of it. The work ethic, the quietness, the belief that you took care of your people and you didn't make a fuss about it. She met Leonard Cawley at a church social when she was 22. He was steady and kind and made her laugh, which she valued more than almost anything. They married the following spring and moved into a small house in Solace Creek that they spent the next 3 decades slowly making their own. Leonard worked at the county highway department. Evelyn worked part-time at the elementary school as an aide and raised Darnell and Priscilla and kept the household running with the same quiet efficiency she'd learned watching Cora. It was a good life. Not a loud one, but good. Leonard's diagnosis came in the spring of 2016. Pancreatic cancer caught late, the way it almost always is. He lasted 14 months after that. Evelyn was with him every day. She held his hand through every treatment, drove him to every appointment, slept in a chair next to his hospital bed in the final weeks because she couldn't stand the idea of him waking up alone in the dark. When he died, she went home, sat in the kitchen for a long time, and then got up and started making arrangements because someone had to. After Leonard was gone, the house got harder to manage. Property taxes climbed. The furnace needed replacing. The roof over the back bedroom developed a slow leak that cost more to fix than Evelyn had expected. On her Social Security income, she was treading water, and she knew it. Darnell brought it up at Thanksgiving 2 years after Leonard passed. He had a way of presenting things that made them sound reasonable before you had time to think them through. "Mom," he'd said, passing the sweet potatoes like the conversation was casual, "you should think about putting the house in our names. Just as a practical matter. If something happens to you, probate takes forever. This way Priscilla and I can make sure everything's taken care of. We're family. It makes sense." Priscilla had nodded along, not quite meeting Evelyn's eyes. Evelyn had thought about it for 2 weeks. She talked to Leonard's old friend Curtis, who knew something about property law, and he'd said it was common enough. Families did it all the time, and if she trusted her kids, there was no real risk. She trusted her kids. Of course she did. They were her kids. She signed the paperwork in December, sitting at the kitchen table with a notary Darnell had arranged. She remembered thinking that the notary had cold hands and that the pen she used ran out of ink halfway through the second signature, and she had to ask for another one. Small details lodge in the memory when bigger things are happening that you don't yet understand. 14 months later, in early March, Darnell called and said he and Priscilla needed to come by to talk. His voice had that particular flatness that Evelyn would later recognize as the sound of someone who has already made a decision and rehearsed how to deliver it. They arrived together on a Tuesday morning. They sat at the same kitchen table where Evelyn had signed the paperwork. They had a folder with documents in it and a brochure for a place called Meadow Glen Senior Living, which had a photograph of a sunlit common room on the cover and a monthly fee of $2,800 printed in small type on the back. Darnell opened the folder. "Mom," he said, using that same calm, reasonable voice. "We've been thinking a lot about what's best for you." Evelyn looked at the brochure. She looked at her son. She looked at her daughter, who was studying the table. She said, "Best for me or best for you?" The silence that followed told her everything she needed to know. They laid it out methodically, the way you'd present a business case to someone you didn't expect to argue back. The house was too much for her to maintain alone. The neighborhood had changed and wasn't as safe as it used to be. Meadow Glen had a lovely garden and organized activities and medical staff on call around the clock. They'd already spoken to an interested buyer, a developer who wanted the lot more than the house itself, and the offer was $390,000, which was strong for Solace Creek. The money would cover Meadow Glen for years, and whatever was left would be divided fairly. They had already called Meadow Glen and confirmed availability. They just needed Evelyn to agree. Priscilla pushed the brochure across the table like she was offering something generous. Evelyn sat with her hands folded in her lap and listened to all of it without interrupting. She had raised these two people. She knew the difference between genuine concern and a plan that had already been set in motion. This was the second thing dressed up as the first, and the dressing wasn't particularly convincing. When they finished, she asked one question. "Did either of you talk to me before talking to the buyer?" Darnell said that wasn't the point. Priscilla said they were trying to help. Evelyn said, "The house Leonard left me. The house I've lived in for 31 years. You've already sold it." "It's legally ours now, Mom," Darnell said. His voice was still patient, still reasonable. "You signed it over. We're making the decision that makes the most sense for the whole family." She noticed he didn't say the decision that makes the most sense for you. He said the whole family, as if her being removed from her own home was a benefit that would be shared equally among them. She asked what would happen if she refused to go. Priscilla looked out the window. Darnell looked at his folder. The answer came slowly, but it came. The house belonged to them. If she refused to leave voluntarily, they would have to pursue formal removal. He said it the way people say things when they're hoping the words will sound better out loud than they do in their heads. They didn't. They left an hour later with the folder and the brochure and the developer's contact number, and they did not offer to help her pack. Priscilla paused at the door and said she hoped Evelyn would come around and that Meadow Glen really was a good place. She'd looked at the reviews. Then they were gone. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. The coffee she'd made before they arrived was cold. She didn't drink it. She just sat there in the quiet of the house and let the reality of what had just happened settle over her slowly, the way cold water rises. She was 74. She had $43, soon to be confirmed after she counted her purse twice. Her Social Security payment had gone out 3 days ago to cover the utilities she'd apparently been paying on a house that was no longer hers. She had no savings. She had a suitcase with a broken latch, 2 cardboard boxes, and the particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from physical tiredness, but from realizing that the people you trusted most have been planning this without you. She went upstairs and packed. She moved slowly and deliberately, choosing what mattered. Photographs of Leonard, his old wristwatch with the worn leather band, her mother Cora's Bible, the one with the water-stained cover and Cora's handwriting in the margins. A few changes of clothes. Her winter coat, the small tin box where she kept personal documents. Everything else, 31 years of accumulated living, she left where it was. The moving crew Darnell had arranged arrived at 8 the following Tuesday morning. They were polite and efficient and did not make eye contact with her. By 10:30, she was on the sidewalk. She stood there for a while, watching traffic pass, feeling invisible in the specific way you feel invisible when the world is moving normally around a moment that has stopped being normal for you. It was while she was standing there that she thought about Creedmoor Hollow Road. The cabin had surfaced in her mind the way half-forgotten things do, not as a plan, but as a question. Her mother had left it to her 7 years ago. She hadn't been back since that one brief visit shortly after Cora's funeral, when she'd looked at the collapsed porch and the broken window and driven away without getting out of the car. She had told herself she'd deal with it eventually. Eventually had never arrived. She knew the cabin was in bad shape. She knew it had no power, no running water, and no functioning anything as far as she could tell from a distance. She knew it was 14 miles outside town on a road that wasn't maintained past the second-mile marker. She also knew it was hers. Not hers the way the Solace Creek house had been hers. Hers in a different way. Cora had left it directly to her, by name, in a handwritten will that Evelyn had filed with the county herself. No one else was on that paperwork. No one else had a claim to it. That thought was enough. She picked up her suitcase and started walking. Getting to Creedmoor Hollow Road without a car and with a suitcase that kept pulling to the left turned out to be the first test of many. Evelyn walked the first 2 miles out of Solace Creek before her legs started asking serious questions. She was 74 years old and hadn't walked anything close to that distance in years, and the March air was cold enough that her fingers had gone stiff inside her coat pockets. She stopped at a gas station at the edge of town, bought a bottle of water and a pack of crackers with $3 in change, and sat on the curb outside to rest. A man in a paint-splattered work truck pulled in while she was sitting there. He was somewhere in his mid-60s, broad-shouldered with a gray beard and the kind of hands that had been doing physical work for 40 years. He glanced at her suitcase, then at her face, and something in his expression shifted from neutral to concerned. "You headed somewhere?" he asked. "Creedmoor Hollow," Evelyn told him. "Off the old logging road past the second-mile marker." He looked at her for a moment. "That's a long way on foot." "I know," she said. His name was Gus Thibodeau. He was a retired carpenter who still took small jobs around the county because, as he put it, sitting still made him feel like he was already dead. He was heading out past Creedmoor anyway to check on a fence repair at a property he maintained. He offered her a ride without making a production of it, the way people in rural Kentucky sometimes do, as if helping a stranger is just a normal part of moving through the day. Evelyn accepted. She didn't explain her situation. He didn't ask. They drove mostly in silence through the thinning outskirts of Solace Creek and into the hill country, where the road narrowed and the tree cover thickened and the houses grew further apart until they disappeared entirely. Gus turned onto the logging road without needing directions. He knew the area well, had done work out this way years back, he said. He remembered a few old structures scattered through the hills, hunting cabins mostly, some of them going back 100 years or more. When the truck's headlights caught the cabin in the clearing, he slowed to a stop and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "I am." Another pause. He got out of the truck. She got out too. He walked the perimeter of the cabin without saying much, testing boards with his boot, looking at the foundation stones, examining the roof collapse from multiple angles. She followed a few steps behind. Inside, through the open doorways where the door itself had long since fallen or been removed, the floor was covered in years of debris. Leaves, branches, animal droppings, the skeletal remains of a bird near the far wall, and a thick layer of grime over everything that suggested the place had been sealed from weather and people in roughly equal measure for a very long time. In the far corner of the main room, something moved, then something else moved. Evelyn counted 4 possums huddled against the base of the wall before they scattered through a gap near the floor. Gus pushed his cap back on his head. He said nothing for a moment. Then, foundation's mostly sound. That's something. The roof on the left side is holding. Walls are solid timber, old growth by the look of it. They don't make them like that anymore. Evelyn took that as encouragement, which she suspected was exactly how he intended it. He helped her for the next 2 hours without being asked. He had a tarp in the truck bed and a length of rope and a decent flashlight, and between them, they covered the roof collapse well enough to keep rain out through the night. He forced the cabin door open, found a window frame that could be temporarily sealed with the spare tarp, and showed her how to bank a small fire in the stone hearth in the corner, which, to both their surprises, still drew properly. Before he left, he pressed 2 things into her hands, a $20 bill and a card with his phone number written on the back in pencil. He said, "There's a diner in Solace Creek called Wanda's, on Birch Street, just past the hardware store. Tell Wanda that Gus sent you. She's a straight shooter, and she usually needs help." Evelyn looked at the card. She looked at the 20. She started to hand both back. He shook his head before she could speak. He climbed into his truck, backed out of the clearing, and was gone. She stood in the dark clearing with the sound of the fire crackling faintly behind her and the wind moving through the pines above and the weight of everything pressing down from all directions at once. She was 74 years old. She had a broken suitcase, a $20 bill, and a cabin that 4 possums had apparently been using as a residence. She went inside, sat down on the cleanest section of floor she could find, and looked at the fire. She did not sleep well that first night. The floor was hard and the cold crept in through every gap in the walls, and something skittered in the ceiling above her head for most of the dark hours. But she slept. And in the morning, when gray light came through the empty window frames and the fire had burnt down to coals, she got up, put her coat on, and started looking for a water source. She found a creek 60 yards down the slope behind the cabin, running fast and cold over flat stones. She carried water back in the empty bottle from the gas station, made 6 trips before she felt she had enough to work with. Her legs ached. Her hands were numb. She kept going. 3 days later, she walked the 4 miles into Solace Creek and found Wanda's diner on Birch Street, just past the hardware store, exactly where Gus had said it would be. Wanda Okafor was a small woman who moved through her diner like she owned the air in it, which she did, along with every table, chair, and the ancient espresso machine behind the counter that she claimed hadn't broken down once in 11 years because she talked to it nicely every morning. She was in her late 50s, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses. She kept pushing up her nose in a way of sizing people up that was direct without being unkind. When Evelyn walked in and said, "Gus Thibodeau sent her," Wanda looked her over for about 4 seconds, then told her to sit down and eat something before they talked about anything else. Evelyn sat. Wanda brought eggs and toast and coffee without asking what she wanted, and Evelyn ate all of it because she hadn't had a proper meal in 2 days and her body was past the point of being polite about it. When the plate was empty, Wanda sat down across from her. She said, "What can you do?" Evelyn thought about it honestly. "I can clean. I can cook well enough for a diner. I can work early and I don't call in sick." Wanda nodded. "I need someone Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. 5 in the morning until 9. Dishes, floors, prep work, whatever needs doing. $14 an hour cash." Evelyn did the math quickly. 3 days, for hours each, $14. That was $168 a week, roughly $650 a month. Combined with her Social Security, it would be enough to buy materials, not many, but enough to start. She said, "I'll be here Tuesday at 5. Wanda said, "Don't be late. I don't function before coffee, and I have no patience before 7. Walking back to the cabin that afternoon with a bag of basic supplies she'd bought at the hardware store, 2 boxes of nails, a roll of plastic sheeting, a small hand saw, and a jar of wood putty, Evelyn felt the first faint outline of something that wasn't quite hope yet, but was adjacent to it. A direction, a sequence of steps, something to do with her hands besides worry. The work began in earnest the following week. He came in and poured himself a cup from the small camp stove he dropped off the previous week, claiming he had 2 and didn't need both. He walked the perimeter of the main room, examining the sealed walls, the plastic-sheeted windows, the patched floor. He crouched down near the hearth and looked at the way she'd remortared 2 loose stones in the firebox. "That's solid work," he said. "Who taught you that?" "Nobody," Evelyn said. "I looked at what needed doing and figured out how to do it." Gus nodded slowly. He didn't say anything else about it, but when he left that afternoon, he came back 20 minutes later with a proper mason's trowel and a bag of hydraulic mortar from his truck. He set them inside the door without comment and drove away again. That was how Gus operated. She was learning. He didn't make speeches. He just kept showing up with things she needed before she knew she needed them. The weeks built on each other. Her body, which had spent years in the comfortable routines of a domestic life, fought back hard in the beginning. Her back ached from bending and lifting. Her knees protested the constant crouching. She moved stiffly in the mornings until the work warmed her up, and she fell asleep each night almost before she finished eating. But somewhere around the 5th week, something shifted. The aching became background noise instead of the main event. Her grip strengthened. She could carry twice what she'd managed in the first days without stopping to rest. She started to see the cabin the way Gus seemed to see it, not as a ruin to be endured, but as a structure that had been built well and had simply been neglected. The bones were good. The timber was old growth, dense and resistant in a way that modern lumber wasn't. The foundation stones, massive slabs of local limestone, had barely moved in over 100 years. Someone had built this place to last, and it had lasted through decades of abandonment and weather and the slow patience of the forest pushing in from every side. She began to feel something she hadn't expected to feel in a place like this. She began to feel, carefully and quietly, at home. By the time May arrived, the cabin was weathertight. Rain no longer came through the roof. Wind no longer moved freely through the walls. The hearth kept the interior warm enough on cool nights. She had a sleeping arrangement she'd built from a timber frame and a mattress of layered pine boughs and dry grass that was genuinely comfortable in a way that surprised her. She had a system for water, a clay pot she'd fire in the hearth coals that held 2 gallons and sat on the camp stove to boil each morning. She had made something livable out of something condemned, and she hadn't asked her children for a single thing. That last thought, she noticed, gave her more satisfaction than almost anything else. Not bitterly, just cleanly, the way it feels when you prove something to yourself that you'd quietly doubted. She was sitting on a log she dragged to the edge of the clearing one evening in mid-May, watching the last light leave the sky through the tree line when she decided to start working on the interior walls in earnest. There were things she hadn't examined closely yet. Sections of the ceiling she'd been avoiding because they looked unstable. A boarded-up alcove in the back wall of the main room she'd assumed was a cold storage nook. She decided she'd start there in the morning. That decision would change everything. The alcove was about 3 feet wide and sealed with 2 rough-cut boards nailed horizontally across the opening. The wood so old and dry it had pulled away from the nails on one side. Evelyn worked the boards loose with the flat end of Gus's mason's trowel, careful not to split them. They came away with a sound like a long exhale, as if the wall had been holding its breath. Behind them was a shallow storage space, maybe 18 inches deep, carved directly into the log wall. Empty mostly. A rusted tin cup sat on the floor of it. A folded piece of burlap had rotted into something that disintegrated when she touched it, and pushed to the very back, wrapped in what had once been oilskin but was now a stiff, darkened shell, was a flat rectangular object about the size of a large book. Evelyn reached in carefully and lifted it out. The oilskin crumbled at the edges when she unwrapped it, but the inside had done its job. Whatever it had been protecting was dry. She carried it to the table she'd set up near the window for the light, sat down, and looked at what she was holding. It was a document. Several pages, in fact, folded together and tied with a strip of leather that had dried to the texture of wood. The paper was thick and cream-colored, the kind of heavy stock that was made to survive. The handwriting on the front page was formal and deliberate, each letter shaped with care, the ink faded to a pale brown, but fully legible. At the top of the first page, in large letters, Deed of Land Grant. Below that a date. September 14th, 1889. Evelyn's hands went very still. She untied the leather strip slowly and opened the document. The language was dense and formal, the legal phrasing of another century, but she read through it carefully twice, making sure she understood what she was looking at. The deed described a parcel of land in Harlan County, Kentucky. It gave boundaries using landmarks, a creek to the south, a ridgeline to the north, a stand of white oaks to the east, and the old logging road to the west. She recognized every one of those landmarks. They described the land she was sitting on, and considerably more of it than she had realized. The deed named the original grantee, a woman named Cora Bell Sutton. Evelyn sat back. Cora Bell Sutton was her great-great-grandmother. She knew the name from family stories her mother had told her, the kind of stories that get passed down through generations of women who don't have much to leave behind except memory and names. Cora Bell had been a freed woman who had settled in Harlan County after the Civil War, built a life on a patch of hill country land, and raised a family there against considerable resistance from people who didn't believe she had the right to own anything. Evelyn's mother, Cora, had been named after her. Evelyn had always assumed the land, whatever it had been, was long since lost to history and legal complications and the 130 years of chaos that tended to erase the property claims of black women in rural Kentucky. She had assumed wrong. Gus said, "She'll take that document seriously. You come with it." 2 weeks later, Dr. Renata Espinoza drove up Creedmoor Hollow Road in a mud-splattered sedan and knocked on the cabin door. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a canvas bag full of reference materials that she'd clearly packed in a hurry. She shook Evelyn's hand, accepted a cup of coffee, and sat down at the table where Evelyn had laid the document out carefully on a clean cloth. Dr. Espinoza put on a pair of cotton examination gloves, which she'd brought herself. She studied the document in silence for 11 minutes. Evelyn counted because she had nothing else to do with her hands. When Dr. Espinoza finally looked up, her expression was not the politely skeptical look of someone managing expectations. It was something else entirely. She said, "Mrs. Marsh, do you understand what you have here?" "I think so," Evelyn said, "but I'd like you to tell me properly." Dr. Espinoza set her coffee down. "This deed is genuine. The paper stock, the ink composition, the recording format, the federal seal, all of it is consistent with land grants issued in this region between 1885 and 1895. The recording number can be verified against the Harlan County Clerk's Historical Archive, and I'm nearly certain it will be." She paused. "This grant covers 116 acres of Harlan County land. Based on the boundary descriptions, a portion of that land, possibly a significant portion, overlaps with parcels that were absorbed into private holdings over the past century through methods that were, in many cases, legally questionable at best." Evelyn said, "What does that mean in plain language?" Dr. Espinoza looked at her steadily. "It means that your ancestor owned this land. It means the deed was never legally voided or transferred. It means there is a credible argument, possibly a very strong one, that the chain of title on several surrounding parcels is clouded by this prior claim." She folded her hands on the table. "Mrs. Marsh, this document could be the foundation of a significant land rights case. One that would matter not just to you, but to the historical record of property rights in eastern Kentucky." Evelyn looked at the document. She looked at the cabin wall she had sealed with her own hands. She looked at the window she had covered with plastic sheeting on her second day here, because the cold was coming through and she had nothing else. How long would something like this take? She asked. Dr. Espinoza said, "Long. These cases are never fast, but I want to help you pursue it, if you're willing. Pro bono. This is exactly the kind of case my research exists to support." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My great-great-grandmother built something on this land, and people spent 130 years pretending it didn't exist. I think it's time to stop pretending." Dr. Espinoza picked up her pen. The case moved slowly, the way Dr. Espinoza had warned it would. Through the summer and into the fall, Evelyn's days fell into a rhythm that she would later describe as the most purposeful of her life. Mornings at Wanda's Diner, for miles there and 4 miles back, 3 days a week. Afternoons at the cabin, continuing the work of restoration that the land rights case had made feel less like survival and more like stewardship. Evenings at the table by the window, reading through the copies Dr. Espinoza had made of the deed and the surrounding historical documents, learning more about Cora Bell Sutton and the world she had navigated with a land grant and sheer determination in post-Reconstruction Kentucky. Dr. Espinoza visited every 2 weeks. She had filed a formal title claim with the Harlan County Clerk's Office and requested a comprehensive historical survey of the land boundaries described in the 1889 deed. The survey took 3 months. When it came back in late August, it confirmed what Dr. Espinoza had suspected. The 116 acres described in Cora Bell Sutton's land grant overlapped with 4 privately held parcels in the surrounding area. Parcels that had changed hands multiple times over the decades through transactions that, when examined carefully, had a notable gap at their origin point. None of them could produce a clear chain of title that predated 1889. The legal process that followed was not dramatic in the way courtroom drama suggests. It was paperwork and filings and carefully worded letters and weeks of waiting for responses that sometimes came and sometimes didn't. But it was moving. Dr. Espinoza was methodical and relentless in the specific way of someone who had been waiting years for exactly this kind of case to walk through a door. Meanwhile, the cabin continued its transformation. Gus had taken on the roof as a personal project, refusing payment, and deflecting every attempt Evelyn made to discuss compensation by simply arriving with materials and getting to work. By September, the roof had been completely reshingled with cedar, period appropriate by coincidence rather than design, because Gus said cedar was what held up best in the hill country, and he wasn't interested in arguing about it. Proper windows had been installed, 6/6 pane style that suited the cabin's age. The porch had been rebuilt from the foundation up, using timber Gus had milled himself from trees that had fallen on his own property in a storm the previous winter. Wanda had contributed in her own way, which was to quietly tell everyone who came into the diner about the woman living out on Creedmoor Hollow Road and what she'd found in that cabin wall. By October, Evelyn had become a subject of considerable local interest. Researchers from the University of Kentucky came to examine the deed. A journalist from a Harlan County newspaper wrote a piece about the land grant and Cora Bell Sutton story that was picked up by 2 larger state papers. A historian who specialized in Reconstruction-era black land ownership in Appalachia drove down from Lexington to spend an afternoon with Evelyn and the document, and left saying it was the most significant primary source find he'd encountered in 20 years of research. The cabin that everyone had written off as a condemned ruin was now on historical maps. It was a Thursday morning in late October when the SUV pulled into the clearing. Evelyn was on the porch with her coffee, watching the light come through the tree line the way she did most mornings now. She recognized the vehicle before the doors opened. She set her coffee down on the porch rail and waited. Darnell got out first, then Priscilla. They were dressed carefully, the way people dress when they want to appear casual but have thought about it too much. They stood by the car for a moment, taking in the restored cabin, the new porch, the cedar roof, the historical survey markers that Dr. Espinosa's team had placed along the property boundary. Their expressions moved through surprise, and then something that looked very much like calculation. Evelyn watched them cross the clearing without going to meet them. She stood on the porch with her hands in her coat pockets and waited. Darnell spoke first. "Mom, you look well," she said. "What do you want, Darnell?" It wasn't a question. He registered that. "We've been worried about you," Priscilla said. "We heard about the news articles, about the deed and the land claim. We want to make sure you were okay, that people weren't taking advantage of you." Evelyn looked at her daughter for a long moment. The last time she'd seen Priscilla had been studying the kitchen table, while Darnell explained that evicting their mother was a practical necessity. That had been 7 months ago. "Nobody's taking advantage of me," Evelyn said. "I have a lawyer. I have people I trust. I'm fine." Darnell took a step toward the porch. "Mom, this land claim, if it goes through, the value of this property increases substantially. You'd be sitting on something significant. Have you thought about what you want to do with it long term? Because family should be involved in something like that. We could help you manage it. Make sure the legal process goes smoothly." Evelyn said, "You mean the land that I've been living on since March while the 2 of you were selling my house to a developer?" Darnell's jaw tightened. "That's not fair." She came down 1 step from the porch, so she was closer to eye level with them. Her voice stayed even. "I want to tell you both something, and I'd like you to listen without interrupting. 7 months ago, I was standing on a sidewalk in Solace Creek with $43 and a broken suitcase because my children decided I was inconvenient. I came out here to a cabin with no roof and no windows and a family of possums living in the corner, and I fixed it. With my hands. Alone. Gus Thibodeau helped me because he's a decent man who didn't know me at all. Wanda Okafor gave me work when I had nothing. Dr. Espinosa is fighting a land rights case on my behalf because she believes in what's right. None of those people owed me anything. None of them had any reason to care whether I survived the winter." She looked at Darnell, then at Priscilla. "You two had every reason, and you put me on a sidewalk." Priscilla said quietly, "We made a mistake, Mom." "Yes," Evelyn said. "You did, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make this moment more comfortable for you." She stepped back up onto the porch. "This property is mine. The land claim is mine. Whatever comes of it is mine, because I found it, and I'm the one who has been here every single day since March keeping this place standing. You're not going to be involved in managing it, and you're not going to benefit from it." Darnell started to speak. She held up one hand. "I'm not angry," she said, and meant it. "I'm past angry. What I am is clear. You show me exactly what I was worth to you when it cost you something to keep me around. I learned from that. I won't forget it. She picked up her coffee from the porch rail. If you ever want to rebuild something real, she said, not a financial arrangement, something real, then come back without the calculation in your eyes, and we can talk about it. But not today. Today I'd like you to leave. They left. Priscilla looked back once from the car. Evelyn watched them go from the porch and felt the same stillness she'd felt on the sidewalk in March, but different now. That stillness had been the absence of everything. This one was full. Gus appeared from around the side of the cabin where he'd been recaulking the foundation stones and had clearly heard most of it. He picked up his coffee from the step where he'd set it down and stood next to her, looking at the empty clearing. You okay? He asked. Evelyn picked up her own coffee. Better than okay, she said. They stood there together in the October morning and drank their coffee and watched the light move through the trees, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else about it. The land rights case settled in February, 5 months after Dr. Espinoza filed the formal claim. It didn't go to trial. The holders of the 4 overlapping parcels, faced with a documented 1889 federal land grant, a verified chain of title gap, and a property law professor who had 15 years of exactly this kind of research behind her, chose to negotiate rather than litigate. The settlement was not a complete restoration of all 116 acres. That would have taken years more and displaced families who had lived on portions of the land for generations through no fault of their own. Dr. Espinoza had been clear-eyed about that from the beginning, and Evelyn had agreed. The goal was never to upend innocent people. The goal was recognition and what partial restitution was possible without causing collateral damage to people who deserved none. What Evelyn received was formal legal recognition of her ownership of the original cabin parcel, 31 acres of surrounding land, and a financial settlement from 2 of the 4 parcel holders whose title gaps were the most legally indefensible. The settlement amount was not disclosed publicly. It was enough to make Evelyn financially secure for the first time in years. Enough to stop counting every dollar and start thinking about what she actually wanted to build. What she wanted to build, it turned out, was exactly what she already had. The cabin was declared a site of historical significance by the Kentucky Heritage Council in the spring, recognized both for its age and architectural integrity and for its connection to Cora Bell Sutton's documented land ownership. One of the few verified examples of a freed black woman's federal land grant in eastern Kentucky that remained traceable through an unbroken physical chain of evidence. A small bronze marker was installed at the edge of the clearing, the kind that catches the afternoon light and makes visitors stop and read carefully. Evelyn's 75th birthday fell on a Saturday in June, 14 months after she'd arrived at the cabin with a broken suitcase and $43. Gus came with a set of hand tools she'd mentioned needing once in passing, wrapped in brown paper because he didn't own gift wrap and wasn't going to buy any. Wanda brought food, an unreasonable amount of it, and set it out on the porch table with the efficiency of a woman who had been feeding people professionally for 30 years. Dr. Espinoza arrived with 2 colleagues from the university who had been working with the Cora Bell Sutton historical record and who treated Evelyn with the particular warmth of people who feel they owe someone a debt they can't fully repay. A dozen others came through the afternoon. Researchers, the journalist who'd written the original newspaper piece, neighbors from the surrounding hollow who had watched the cabin's resurrection with growing admiration, the historian from Lexington who had called the deed the most significant primary source find in 20 years came back with a copy of the journal article he'd published about it, with Evelyn listed in the acknowledgments. At one point in the afternoon, Evelyn stood in the clearing and looked at the cabin. The cedar roof caught the June sun. The new porch held 8 people comfortably. Through the open door, she could see the restored interior, the old timber walls, the stone hearth, the table by the window where she'd first read the deed by morning light. She thought about Cora Bell Sutton, who had built something on this land 130 years ago and had it taken from her by the slow erosion of time and a legal system that wasn't designed to protect her claim. She thought about her mother Cora, who had kept the cabin and kept the name and passed both forward without knowing exactly why, the way people sometimes preserve things by instinct when they can't articulate what they're preserving. She thought about the Tuesday morning in March when she'd stood on a sidewalk in Solace Creek with nothing, and how the only reason she'd thought of this place was because every other door had been closed. Gus appeared at her shoulder with 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one. "Strange how things work out," he said. Evelyn looked at the cabin. "My mother used to say that nothing gets lost forever. It just waits for someone stubborn enough to go looking." Gus considered that. "You were stubborn enough." "I didn't have much choice," Evelyn said. He shook his head. "You always had a choice. You just kept making the right one." She drank her coffee and let that sit. The land Cora Belle Sutton had claimed in 1889 was recognized and recorded. The cabin built on it stood solid and warm. The woman who had been told she was too old and too much and not worth the trouble was standing in the June sunshine on her own porch, surrounded by people who knew exactly what she was worth. Darnell and Priscilla had not come back. Evelyn had heard through Carol Reeves, an old acquaintance in Solace Creek, that they'd seen the newspaper articles and the subsequent coverage and had consulted a lawyer about whether the land settlement created any claim they could pursue. The lawyer had told them it didn't. Evelyn felt nothing when she heard this, which was itself a kind of answer about where she'd arrived. She had stopped waiting for them to become the people she needed them to be. That waiting had kept her small for too long. When she let it go, the space it left didn't feel empty. It felt like room. Her days now had a shape that suited her. Mornings at Wanda's 2 days a week, because she genuinely liked the work and liked Wanda and saw no reason to stop. Afternoons at the cabin, maintaining the property, tending the small vegetable garden she'd started along the south-facing wall where the light was good. 3 afternoons a month, hosting visiting researchers and students who came to see the deed and hear about Cora Belle Sutton's story. A stipend from the Kentucky Heritage Council for her role as the site's official caretaker. Modest but steady. She had built a life that fit her from almost nothing at 74 years old. On quiet evenings, she sometimes walked the boundary of her land, all 31 acres of it, following the creek south and the ridge north and the line of white oaks east. She thought about what her great-great-grandmother had felt walking the same ground in 1889, newly documented, legally recognized, standing on something that was finally, formally hers. She thought they would have understood each other without needing many words. One evening in late summer, sitting on the porch as the light left the sky, she wrote in the journal she'd started keeping in the spring. She wrote, "I was thrown away at 74 and landed somewhere I was always supposed to be. I didn't know that when I arrived. I was just trying to stay warm. But the land knew. The cabin knew. Cora Belle knew, maybe, when she hid that deed in the wall. She was keeping it for someone. I think she was keeping it for me." She closed the journal and watched the fireflies come out over the clearing. She was not the woman who had stood on that sidewalk anymore. That woman had been afraid and hollowed out and unsure whether she had anything left worth fighting for. This woman knew exactly what she had. She had built it herself, with her hands and her stubbornness and the unexpected kindness of people who owed her nothing and gave her everything anyway. The cabin glowed behind her, warm and solid, the way things glow when they've been saved by someone who refused to give up on them. She stayed on the porch until the stars came out. Then she went inside, put the kettle on, and sat down at the table by the window where everything had started. She was home, completely, legally, irrevocably home, and nobody was ever going to change that again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.